All right, so free exercise clause then is our ability to practice religion however we want. We've talked about this at least a little bit before with those weird people up in the mountains in North Carolina that like to prove their faith by holding poisonous snakes, right? Yeah, real thing. There are issues sometimes in terms of law and our free exercise clause. Some of these might be sort of apparent or obvious to you. Others of them might actually even come as a little bit of a surprise to you. For instance, Jehovah's Witnesses, they're not allowed to actually say the Pledge of Allegiance based on their religion. All right? In which case, there are instances there that if you were to allow a Jehovah's Witness not to engage in the Pledge of Allegiance, okay, then you can make an argument that you're violating the Establishment Clause because you're actually promoting a specific religion in that instance. Whereas if you force them to say the Pledge of Allegiance, you're then violating their free exercise clause. Do we see how that can be contradictory and cause a problem? And there's issues then that the courts have to address when looking at things like that. I actually find it funny that here, to me, the easiest way around that is you can force somebody to stand up, but you can't force them to say anything. Ironically, based on your little school handbook, it's the exact opposite, apparently. Is you don't have to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, but you have to say it. Which I find a little ironic, but whatever. Alright? Understand, too, that when we're looking at the free exercise clause, we have a distinction between belief and practice. Okay? So, you are allowed to believe whatever it is you want to believe. Okay? If you want to believe that some dude named John's going to come down here in a spaceship and take you to a new planet, like, knock yourself out. You can believe that. Okay? But the exercise is not always going to be protected, and we'll see instances when that happens. Alright? Now, the way this used to work, okay, and I say used to because it doesn't work this way anymore. The way that it used to work is that if there was a conflict over the free exercise, the burden of proof fell on the state. What does burden of proof mean? Lauren, do you know what that term is? No? Kim, any idea? So burden of proof is who is the individual or which party engaged in a lawsuit is the one that must show cause. Right? So, burden of proof falling with the states means that the states must show that specifically they're not denying somebody's religious freedom. Right? Okay? That makes it really hard for the state to have any sort of restrictions or laws in order to restrain free religious practices. Okay? By the 90s, we're actually going to change that. The burden of proof now is on the individual. And so it is a responsibility of the individual to prove that this action is essential to the free practice of their religion. And that makes it easier for the states to restrict it or for the government to create law that is sort of in violation of free exercise. All right? And making that sort of an acceptable practice. Alright? This is just more information about that, but understand that that's where it comes. Okay, so some things that have now been deemed to be acceptable in terms of restraints, right? So things that the state can actually restrain in terms of the free exercise of religion. Okay? You cannot engage in polygamy as a part of your religion. Okay? So you cannot say that your religion says you got to get married 6 times and have 6 wives, so you got to have 6 wives. Now, I believe wholeheartedly, I really do, that as we're beginning to redefine the term marriage and how marriage exists in the United States, I think it's really only a matter of time before this probably becomes legal too. Right? Because the basic concept here in America, at least the America that we're moving towards, is we have a basic understanding or premise of, whatever somebody does individually, so long as it's not harmful to another person is pretty much acceptable, right? So if your religion says 6 wives or 6 husbands, go on, man, knock yourself out. And those of you that are you're all teenagers, you're going to realize real quick that you don't want that. Personally. I mean, maybe, but I'm going to tell you right now, being married to one person is hard. I can't imagine how difficult it would be being married to like 6 people. Other things that are restricted, and this is always difficult to say because it's a double negative, but you can't not vaccinate children as a part of your religious beliefs. So if you believe, right, that vaccination is sort of defying your faith in God, right, because God is supposed to protect you from illness, that is not an acceptable reason to not vaccinate your children if you want your children to attend public school. Now, can you voluntarily choose not to vaccinate? Yes. Will your child be allowed to enter a public school if you voluntarily choose not to vaccinate? No. Do you understand why? What? Because you then put other children at risk. Okay? And so now you're essentially violating other children's well-being. That's an easy example or an easy understanding of where free exercise of religion can be prohibited. Alright? There are instances where things are deemed acceptable though, right? So, Jehovah's Witnesses, I don't understand the Jehovah's Witness religion incredibly well, so don't ask me like 100 questions about it. But I guess if you're a Jehovah's Witness in New Hampshire, you're allowed to cover your license, or portion of your license plate that says live free or die, because that violates their religion. Again, it's deemed pretty much acceptable that Jehovah's Witnesses do not have to engage in the Pledge of Allegiance. And there's actually a Supreme Court case from Wisconsin about Amish children not attending school after 8th grade. That's actually acceptable for religious purposes. Now, if you are not Amish and you quit going to school right now, you're breaking the law, and you and or your parent could be jailed for it, just so you understand. Okay? Freedom of speech, then. We talked about this a little bit already. Do you have unlimited freedom of speech? No, you do not, right? You cannot say whatever you want, whenever you want. That is not deemed acceptable in all situations. Okay? And we'll talk about the way that we're going to determine whether or not it is or is not acceptable. Okay? But understand that this is pretty much the most basic, number one, essential freedom that you have. Without freedom of speech, we're really not free at all. And so when we say freedom of speech, it encompasses more than just talking. So understand that as well. Because what we're talking about now is speaking, listening, expressing yourself. We're going to talk about a lot of things here that get brought into this or that are accountable as a part of this. All right, now, what's on the board there in the middle? The clear and present danger doctrine. We call it the clear and present danger test. This will be on your exam, I promise you. Because this is the essential concept that you need to understand in terms of whether or not we can restrict speech. Okay? Does that speech dictate a clear and present danger? Right? If the answer is yes, then it can be restricted. If the answer is no, we generally allow that speech to continue. Okay, to give you an understanding, right, and let's just take something that's absolutely terrible, okay, but if you got a big old, like, poster board, right, and you wrote on there, black people are monkeys, and you stood on the side of the road, okay, is there a clear and present danger there? Yes. The clear and present danger being to traffic and causing accidents. If you went to a public park and held up the same sign, is there a clear and present danger? Sadly, probably not, right? And truthfully, one of the things that we do protect in freedom of speech is the freedom to be ignorant, okay? It's the freedom to engage in speech that is deemed insensitive or inflammatory or simply unjust, okay? You're allowed to do that. The KKK has a long history of that, right? And their speech is generally protected, all right? So, this is what we're talking about down here at the bottom, this imminent threat to society. Again, the concept or the example that everybody always uses is you can't go into a crowded movie theater and yell fire, right? If you do, people panic because that's just human nature, right? And people like me that are big and strong, I'm going to get out, right? And people that are little and short, right, you're probably going to get knocked to the ground and then trampled to death. And whoever goes in and yells fire can actually be held accountable for essentially a murder type statute. You're not going to get murdered because there's no intent. All right, but you can be held accountable for wrongful death in an instance like that if you are engaged in some activity that clearly is a threat to other members of society and their well-being. Sheddick versus United States is another example with the clear and present danger doctrine. This is really talking about overthrowing the government, right? Because that's like pro-communist stuff. Okay? Again, if you're standing out with a sign, like in the middle of a public park that says, Trump's not a real president, completely acceptable. Okay? If you stand out with a sign that says, right, not my government, don't recognize the U.S. government, overthrow the U.S. government, probably acceptable. Okay? If I sat in this class and told you that on Friday when Donald Trump was inaugurated, he is not a real president, we should not listen to him, we should all rise up and overthrow the government, is that acceptable? No. And this is where some of those differences and some of those subtleties, some of those nuances come into play, right? If I go to a public park and get out a little like megaphone and start talking about how terrible a person Donald Trump is that protected? Yes. Why is it not protected if I do it here in this classroom? Anybody want to guess? Matthew, what do you think? Bias is actually, sadly, not the issue. Okay? In all honesty, your teacher can be as biased as he or she wants to be. I would hope that they wouldn't be, especially not in an AP government class or in any government class, but that's not the issue. The issue actually stems from the fact that if I told you this, how many of you would have a reasonable expectation to believe that if you did what I said, right, and if you sort of believed the way that I believed, it would cause you to have a better grade in this class? That's a reasonable expectation. So you could reasonably believe that as my student, if I'm telling you, hey, we got to kill Donald Trump because Donald Trump's not a real president, and you go out and kill Donald Trump, you're going to get an A in my class, that's a reasonable belief. Okay? Which is why, specifically in this situation, I would not be able to say that. That would not be protected under my freedom of speech, which is different than me, even the same person, going to a public park and saying it there. Yes, sir?
Why is it fine for California professors and stuff to do that?
Because college is a little bit different than high school. Because there's more autonomy in terms of college. One, you don't necessarily have to take those classes. This is a requirement for graduation. Political science is not a requirement for graduation from college unless you're a political science major. Okay? Additionally, there are generally multiple political science professors per college campus. You're welcome to change professors at any given time for any reason. Again, not the same responsibility here at high school. You can't go to Miss Reeves and be like, I don't like Coach Baker, I want a new teacher. She's going to be like, I don't care. Right? You don't have the same autonomy, you don't have the same responses that you would have on a college campus. Okay? Which is why they're slightly different. Alright? We have what's called the prior restraint doctrine. Prior restraint is an opportunity to restrain or to limit freedom of speech really before it even begins to happen. Okay, so here we're blocking speech before speech has occurred. Okay, this is generally deemed to be unconstitutional. There are rare exceptions in which it is deemed to be an issue of national security. And what that means is that a member of the military can't go run around telling people what's going on in Area 51, right? Because that's an issue of national security. We know what Area 51 is? What? That's not accurate. That's what everybody thinks it is.
Oh, so that's where you're referring
Well, no, I mean, that is what I'm referring to, because that's what everybody thinks it is. Everybody thinks it's aliens. Okay? It's basically an Air Force base where they test, like, all types of new technologies, which is why you get all sorts of UFOs out there, because they're U.S. Air Force planes that don't look like anything else that we've ever seen, which is why it's unidentified. Yes, ma'am. Now, when we are going to engage when we're going to engage in something that causes a loss of freedom of speech or some sort of restriction on freedom of speech, understand that whatever those provisions are, they are supposed to be clearly stated or clearly worded so that the average person can understand it. This way, nobody is going to inadvertently violate that. And now this is going to get to the point of like safe spaces in college. Do y'all know what those are? I'm going to be 100% honest with you. I don't think I fully understand them. Okay? I got out of college before safe spaces really existed. I don't really fully understand how they work, but apparently in certain places on most college campuses anymore, you're not allowed to say things, like anything. I don't really fully understand how it works. It seems to me that some college campuses are now actually engaging in segregation for the purpose of safe spaces, right? That every sort of subpopulation of Americans deserves their own safe space, and so like white people all go over here to this area, and black people all go over here, and Hispanics go over here, and Asians go over there, and that way you can just engage with your own people and you don't say anything that's insensitive to other races. Or I don't think probably do it gender-wise, right? Gender identity-wise. I don't know. Like at this point, there's so many. I'm not 100% certain really how they function, because I'm gonna tell you right now, every single one of you, you're gonna go to college, and at some point in time, somebody's gonna say something that offends you. It's called college. Okay? I mean, it is. Because the truth of the matter is in college, you should be exposed to ideas that are different from yours. You should be expected to defend your own ideas, because that's how you learn. Okay? You do not learn by surrounding yourself by a bunch of people who think and speak and feel the exact same way you do. That simply reiterates what you already believe, and no education is occurring there. Okay? That's one of the reasons why, and we'll talk about it later, why affirmative action programs exist in college admissions. That's why race is a factor in college admissions, because race plays a role in sort of your view of life. Okay? And so you only surround your people with the same view that you already have. Your view cannot grow or learn or change or even really be defended. All right? Political speech is obviously highly important to protect in terms of a democracy. Political speech is almost always protected. Okay? Again, in large part because it is the sort of foundation or the basis of democracy in the United States. We believe in what we call the free exchange of ideas. Okay? You can only have the free exchange of ideas if people are protected in their political beliefs. All right? We already talked about how violence doesn't work, right? I gave you that whole example about, right, when violence or when threats are no longer deemed acceptable. Do we remember that? Right? Like you can't tell somebody that you're going to kill them, because if they believe you, that's not protected under freedom of speech. All right, symbolic speech. When we talk about symbolic speech, we're really sort of talking about action here generally. All right. So we've talked about Texas versus Johnson on a couple of occasions and flag burning being deemed acceptable. Realize or understand that a lot of this is very subjective, and it's one of the things that drives a lot of people sort of crazy about law. Because explain to me the difference between burning the American flag or burning a draft card during the Vietnam War. Can anybody explain the difference? See, I really can't either. In fact, the only difference that I can tell you is that one is legal and one is illegal. Which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense to me, although you also got to realize that they're occurring about 20 years apart, and obviously Americans' ideologies and belief systems change over the course of time. Okay? That being said, something like cross burning, yeah, it's not protected. Nor should it be. Okay? Because if you burn a cross on somebody's lawn, what are you saying? That's a threat. Okay? Historically, that is viewed as a threat, in which case that is not going to be protected. That is essentially the symbolic equivalent of saying, I am going to kill you, right? Not a protected sort of speech. Okay, sedition, we know what sedition is. Speaking poorly about the government. Hopefully you remember back to APUSH with the Alien and Sedition Acts. There was actually a period of time where speaking negatively about the government was a violation of law. You couldn't say anything negative about the government. If that were the case, I'd have been in jail a long time ago. Right? Because I haven't really had anything nice to say about the government since I was old enough to vote. Right? Basically, what we realize moving forward, though, is that speaking negatively about the government is our right as Americans. You don't have to say nice things about Obama or Trump or any politician if you don't want to. And in fact, you should be allowed to criticize them if you think that they're doing a poor job. However, we stop at advocating overthrowing the government. That's still not acceptable. Right? You cannot advocate armed revolution. Right? Now, again, here's the thing. So, we then have to define sort of when are we advocating overthrowing the government. Okay? Because if I read the beginning of the Constitution to you, does anybody know what it says? Do you realize that the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, like what we study historically, actually tells you specifically that when government stops working, it is your responsibility, right? Not your option. It is your responsibility to rise up and overthrow the government. Okay, now, is that protected? Yes, absolutely. I can teach you that. That's protected. Because is there really an imminent danger? No. Okay? And the truth of the matter is one guy sitting in a public park saying we need to overthrow the government, Trump sucks. There's no imminent danger there. Right? Which, again, makes this sort of very subjective because what does the word imminent mean? Imminent means soon to happen, right? What is the defined soon? Right? Whose birthday is soon? That mean a week? A month? Right? In terms of things that happen politically, that could be years. Right? Imminent is a very loose term. All right? The other thing that comes in here is the urging to do something rather than believe something. Right? I mean, here's the thing. I would like to teach you that you should be wary of your government at all times, period. Right? Do not believe everything your government tells you wholeheartedly. And that's a way that you should believe, not a way that you should act, though. And there's a difference there. Okay. Freedom of the press. All right. Just just a little warning before I'm gonna get on a little soapbox here for a minute. You know what that means? Like I'm basically gonna preach to you for a minute, which I generally don't do. But this one is important, and this one has become even more important over the last decade, and then specifically over the last like 18 months, it is now wildly important. Do you understand the purpose of freedom of press? Why was freedom of the press included in the First Amendment? What is the role of the press? To do what? To inform the population, right? Okay, it's to inform the population, it's to hold politicians accountable, it's to do a number of things that make us as a society better, more educated, more capable of dealing with things. Okay, now, over the last decade, right, media and the press have sort of changed even more so how they function, right? And what is the number one goal of, let's take CNN for instance, right? What is the number one goal of CNN, Josh?
To make Trump look like crap.
No. Leanne, what do you think the number one goal of CNN is? Trent, what's the number one goal of CNN? Kyle?
Well, it is the Clinton News Network, but it is to inform the people.
It's a business. Its number one purpose is to make money. If it ceases to make money, what happens to it? It ceases to exist. In which case, all media is business. All business exists to create wealth. Right? So that's the first thing that you have to understand, is all of these people are out to make money. Now, over the last decade, that's actually gotten a little bit worse. Because over the last decade, okay, in order to be competitive in the media market, you have to be first to everything. It's no longer a matter of whether or not you're right, but a matter of whether or not you're first. And if you actually go back to the Sandy Hook incident, which was, what, like 6 years ago now? Okay? And I want to say that it was CNN. Alright, a couple of hours after that story broke, CNN went on air and identified the shooter. They identified the wrong person. And that individual began getting calls from friends and all sorts of people asking and leaving messages on his phone about why he would do something like that, despite the fact that the real shooter was dead on the scene. Now, how do you think this affects this poor kid's life for the remainder of his life? Because there will be people with better memories than I have, right, who hear that name and will forever associate him with Sandy Hook. Which means he could be 40 years old and looking for a job, right? Somebody comes across his name on an application. Oh, I remember him. He's the one that killed a bunch of kids. Even though he did nothing of the sort. And this becomes a problem in terms of media. And now, it gets even worse because when we look at media today, right, in terms of business, hopefully you recognize that we have all kinds of media sources that are not actually media. Right? And you should recognize or understand that we had an incident less than 6 months ago in which a guy went into a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. and started firing off a gun. Because he read on the internet that Hillary Clinton was trafficking children through the basement of this pizza parlor. Did the pizza parlor have a basement? No! But this guy read something online and wholeheartedly believed that Hillary Clinton was trading children for sex. And so he went into an establishment, a business, and started firing a gun because he was going to get to the bottom of these. And people begin to believe things like this. This is highly problematic. Now, that was my old soapbox. But here's the problem. It's actually gotten worse. Because in the last year and a half, we have elected somebody President of the United States who has done things that are actually highly detrimental to the legitimate press. Okay? Last week, Donald Trump refused to answer the question of a CNN reporter during a press conference because he claimed that CNN was a fake news source. Since being elected, President-elect, right, since winning the election, at one point in time, Donald Trump actually ditched, like literally ran away from and hid from the presidential press corps. These are the people who travel around with the president and report on what the president is doing. Now, do you realize why that's problematic? Because that removes a level of accountability. That in free societies, that accountability is essential. All right? So, let's talk about freedom of press historically then. All right, I'll get off my little soapbox now. Now, again, there's some balance here as to in terms of what we allow in the press, or what we claim to be freedom of press, and what we're going to not allow. And the court, again, has to determine this. And so we'll go over some of these examples. Right? But I need you to understand that for the most part, most aspects of society are open to the press. And in fact, in '66, we have the Freedom of Information Act, which affords press the opportunity to pretty much all government files. It all becomes public information. In fact, if you so desired, you could go down to HR in Rosenberg, and you could go find Dr. Bowen, and you could tell her, I would like to read all of Coach Baker's emails since he's been at George Ranch High School. And she would give you some paperwork, you would fill it out, right? You would submit it to her a week later, or 2 weeks later, or however long it took, because I'm sure I've written a lot of emails since I've been here, right? She would provide you with copies of all of that information. And you have the right to it. Now, I will tell you right now, don't go around and sort of abuse that right, because you need to understand that obviously there's stuff in my emails that is still protected, right? Because let's say I had to email your mother about your behavior in class. Should a third party who gets to read all of my emails, should they be able to know that about you? No. You are a minor, right? Your information is private and protected. And what that means is that's why it takes like a week or 2 weeks to get all this information, because Dr. Bowen and a bunch of other people would have to go through, and it's called redact. They would have to remove the names, the student ID numbers, email addresses, to ensure that your privacy as a student is still maintained. So don't just go and do it because I told you you had the right to. Have a reason before you do it. All right? Understood? Got it. We have what's called executive privilege. All right? That is actually a real thing. The President of the United States does not need to divulge all information to press. However, understand that executive privilege cannot be used in criminal cases. Okay? The President cannot withhold information if it is deemed a criminal case, or if it's something that is deemed to be in violation of law. And there are other instances where we will limit freedom of the press. A judge can issue what is called a gag order, which prevents the press from reporting about a specific trial. Okay? That can only be done if it is deemed necessary for a fair trial. Right? Because a lot of the times, especially in high-profile public cases, when I was a few years younger than you are now, O.J. Simpson killed his ex-wife and her friend. Might have been more than friends, I don't know. Okay? And I say killed, even though he was not convicted, because anybody with half a brain knows he did it. And that was a highly public case. that it became very difficult for jurors to not go in and already have preconceived notions about whether or not OJ was guilty or innocent. Right? In instances like that, judges can issue gag orders to make sure that the press isn't reporting things that could sway or influence jury members. Alright? Shield laws, reporters are actually protected from divulging sources, because without them, then sources would cease to exist. Alright? There are defamation issues at times that we need to understand. We need to understand the difference between types of defamation. I don't ask this on the test, so don't worry. Like, if you don't remember libel or slander, just know that both words are defamation. Okay, one is written, the other is spoken. And they're not protected by the First Amendment. That means that you cannot just go around saying whatever you want about an individual. And so you can't go around, for instance, and say that Hillary Clinton is engaged in child sex trafficking, right? Because that would be liable. Now, in doing that, she could actually file suit. And I'm going to tell you right now, Trump will do this probably at some point in time in his first 4 years in office, because Trump loves to sue people. And a lot of people talk negatively about Trump. So my guess is at some point in time he will do this. On the bright side, libel and slander do require the burden of proof to fall upon the individual who's bringing suit, because they have to prove that their reputation was negatively affected as a result of this. Now, if you pay attention to the press a lot, they will always talk about the accused, right, or allegedly. They have little words like that they can throw in, where they can be like, allegedly Donald Trump sexually assaulted 8 women, right? Is that a factually accurate statement? Yes. I don't know if it was 8. I don't know how many. I don't know the number. Okay? But did women accuse Donald Trump of sexual assault? Yes. That's a true statement. Okay? Now, did a reporter say Donald Trump is a sexual predator? No, because that's not proven. Right? But allegedly he's a sexual predator. Like, get the difference? Alright? Obscenity is not protected. Right? Obscenity is, well, understand, obscenity is a broadly defined term that is based upon community standards. Obviously, community standards vary from community to community, which makes that a little bit difficult as well. But the basic idea here, right, it used to be that there's no redeeming value, and therefore it would not be protected. Now you've got to prove that community standards are violated, state obscenity laws are violated, and there's a serious lack of any sort of actual political or artistic or literary value. Okay? So what do we say then when we talk about obscenity? Right? Because an easy example with this of something that wouldn't be protected by the First Amendment, would fall under freedom of press. Anybody ever read a book called Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov? I had to read this book in college. It is the most disturbing thing I've ever read in my life. It was really, really difficult to get through, because the whole premise of the book is about like a 40-year-old guy who falls in love with an 11-year-old girl, and it gets graphic at times. Okay? It is disturbing. I would argue it's obscene. Yet under freedom of the press laws, it's deemed acceptable because it is seen as having literary value. Okay? What? Alright? So, sort of same things with like pornography or something like that. If it is deemed to have artistic value, it's acceptable. And again, that's like what constitutes art. Because again, it's a very subjective term. Okay? Understand that a student press, yeah, y'all have no rights, so don't even worry about it. Okay? And here's, so you understand, here's the actual legal reason for it. Okay? Dr. Black, because he's the head of the school, essentially functions as like the editor or producer of any online magazine, right? The Wrangler, the student news that's produced here, and theoretically as the head of the news or the editor, he could cut any article he seemed fit to cut for whatever reason he so desired, and there's no recourse that you have against it. All right? That's the actual reason for it. We do regulate the public airwaves. The FCC is what oversees that in terms of press. Again, making sure that basic things aren't violated. The FCC actually levels fines when it does happen. A good example is, and I mean this is 10 or 12 years ago now probably, but there was a Super Bowl halftime show in which Janet Jackson and Justin Timberlake were performing, and Janet Jackson had a wardrobe malfunction that resulted in a $500,000 fine on CBS, right? Which also led to subsequent shows being tape delayed by like 10 seconds, so that way if something like that ever happened again, they could switch cameras or dump it or whatever, right? Do you guys know who Howard Stern is?
Yes.
Yeah. Howard Stern, many years ago, before he was on satellite radio and before he was on, what is it? America's Got Talent, right? Isn't that the show he was on? Okay. He actually had a very contentious relationship with the FCC for a long time, in which he would do things specifically trying to skirt the laws of the FCC and challenge that basic freedom. Welcome you to read up on that on your own if you so desire. Freedom of assembly and then petition. Okay, we'll start with freedom of petition. Regardless of what you believe about the Obama administration, I will tell you this. Freedom of petition has actually gotten considerably better under Obama. They have utilized technology and engaged in something that is highly beneficial. You can go to a website called whitehouse.gov, and there you will find hundreds, if not 1,000 petitions at any given time to the United States government. Right? The Obama administration actually created a policy that said if your petition gets 25,000 signatures, and I want to say you only have like 60 days to get them, or maybe 30, right? It's not an unlimited amount of time that you have to get these, but if you get the 25,000 signatures necessary, the Obama administration will address your petition. That doesn't mean you get what you want. It simply means that they will recognize that you created a petition because you have freedom of petition, and they will say something about it. For instance, after Obama's re-election in 2012, all 50 states created a petition to secede from the Union. Not all 50 states got the 25,000 signatures necessary. Texas got well over 100,000. Obviously, Texas is still a part of the United States. So the Obama administration basically addressed it, said that it's not legal, and moved on in life. All right. Freedom of petition also serves as the justification for lobbying. We'll get into that later when we get into bureaucracy and whatnot. All right. Petition also exists in terms of political association. This is where this comes, or association period. This is where this comes from. Both political and personal association. All right. Understand, though, that there are some limitations on it. The HACT Act is one of those limitations because federal employees are not supposed to engage in political discourse. Okay? Hopefully, you could easily recognize this just in terms of what Trump's done in the last, 2 months, right? Because in the last 2 months, Trump has sent out a tweet about how Boeing is trying to rip off the government in terms of building a new Air Force One, a new airplane. Okay? After Trump tweeted that out, Boeing stock tanked. Right? It went down drastically because of what the president did. Okay? Similar to him endorsing LL Bean via Twitter like a week ago. Not an acceptable recourse of action. All right? Freedom of assembly now. This is the actual gathering of people together. First thing I want you to understand about freedom of assembly, yes, you have it, but no, it is not unlimited. In fact, it is not even close to unlimited. And you cannot all of a sudden decide and organize a student walkout in which all 2,500 students here at George Range decide that for whatever reason, you're gonna protest, you're gonna leave school one day. Let's even say you don't leave during school hours because you don't wanna get in trouble or miss class, so at 3:30, you're all going to leave together and go walk down 762, right, and march and protest about whatever you wanna protest about, right? The terrible school lunches here, I don't care, okay? You're not allowed to do that. Do you know why? That would be an issue of public safety. Okay? Because obviously there's a heavy amount of traffic at 3:30 here due to parents and buses and Polly Ryan and Reading and all of that. They're not going to let you block 762 at 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. They built a school that only has one way in and one way out, really. Unless you want to go the long way. Okay? So there are restrictions on that. Alright? And the restrictions exist for like the public good. Again, you can't. Alright, think about it like this. Anybody go to the championship parade last year for the football team? Up by Trailer Stadium? Right? Maybe you were in a band and you had to go. I don't know. But what you would have noticed is that the school district actually had to go and get permission for that to shut down those individual streets, right? And have police presence there to block traffic to make sure people didn't try to drive through the little parade. Like, that's part of what happens with this freedom of assembly is you have to have permission, police presence, et cetera, and because it needs to be orderly. Now, what happens if you're the KKK and you want to hold a rally and walk down the street in your stupid little bed sheets, right? Because you don't like Obama. Okay? Are you allowed to do that? The answer is yes. Okay? Now, if the KKK walked down the street, you think anybody'd be out there protesting the KKK? Yes! Hey, I would. Alright? Now, understand then that this is what we call a heckler's veto. Because here's the thing, you should recognize that if somebody wants to do something like that, there are going to be a lot of people who are opposed to the ideologies of the KKK and would want to protest the KKK in their little rally. Alright? However, this is what we call a heckler's veto. You cannot deny the KKK the right to march simply because there might be an opposing group who claims that there might be violence, because then what happens? Then literally there are no more assemblies ever, because every group has some alternative group that dislikes them and goes, hey, we're going to be violent. Even if they have no intention of violence whatsoever, even if they're not even going to show up because they don't really care, they're going to be like, nah, if it's going to be violent, you can't do that. Right? And then there are no more assemblies ever, period. Understood? Alright? So, it's what we call the heckler's veto, okay? And it doesn't really work. Okay? Instead, what generally will happen is you'll have reply to the people petitioning for the assembly and a statement of, alright, you have to go and get more, you have to pay for extra police presence and security, yada, 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 yada. Okay? Also understand that this only applies to public places, right? If you have like, I don't know, think of like the VFW, right? You know what that is? It's like an adult fraternity. VFW is Veterans of Foreign Wars, right? So military personnel, they have their own little lodge where they gather and have meetings, and I don't know, I'm not a member. I guess tell war stories. I don't know what they do, right? My father-in-law's a member. Beats me with it. And they can have all the assemblies they want because that's private, all right? So understand that it is only applying to public spaces. Okay, wonderful. We got through all of that very quickly. I appreciate your help. I know that gets a little boring and long-winded today. On the bright side, it should be a little bit easier moving forward.